If you like these videos, please check out my full course at www.lsat.totaltestprep.net with tons of clearly explained actual LSAT questions written by someone who's mastered test and helped others master it, and an evaluation period where you only pay if you want to continue.
Okay, so in this video, we're going to cover the introduction to the questions. So, what do the questions test? The questions ask you about the relationships between the fundamental elements, so the relationships between those elements. So, how do they relate to diagrams? What are the different question types? And how do we approach them? That's what we're going to cover in this video. So, with respect to the basic information, now the questions in context. So, what's going on with the questions? Well, the previous videos covered the basics of setting up the game. And setting up the game and setting up the rules is important because you need to be comfortable making diagrams in order to attack questions. And essentially, my method is essentially to create diagrams to test the choices. So you're making diagrams for each of the choices. Well, not for each of the choices, you'll see as it gets a little bit more complex, but you're working the choices with the diagrams, and it's an efficient form of plug and chug. So we're going to go in a lot more detail on all of this as we hit the questions and all that. But for right now, I'm just giving you an overview. Now, if there's a working diagram, that means that the movable elements are in the structure and none of the rules are broken. And the question types basically ask you for what can or what must or what cannot be true or false. So can be false, must be false, can be true, must be true, etc. So a working diagram lets you know if something is or isn't the right answer. Essentially, you're making a test case or an example. So that's what I mean by plug and chug. And making this diagram is a mechanical step-by-step process. That's what we're going to learn in each of the videos. So that's what's going on with respect to making the diagrams to test the choices. The other approaches, other mainstream or conventional approaches from other companies, require you to make deductions. Now, the deductions can save time, but they're difficult to learn. They're difficult to learn to make. And if you miss a key deduction, you might get the whole game wrong. So deductions have their problems as well. My approach is mechanical. So all you need to learn is the steps and practice doing it until it's automatic. So unlike the deductions, you don't have to worry about, relying on something that requires maybe intuition or talent. It's just a mechanical step-by-step process. So there's no deductions. You don't have to worry about that. Now, the different question types will implement the method in slightly different ways. So that's what we're going to cover in the videos. But fundamentally, it's just the mechanical, essentially like I mentioned in the previous slide, a mechanical plug and chug approach. Now, with respect to the question types, so there's 5 major question types which comprise the majority of the questions. So around 70 to 80% of the questions are going to be the 5 major question types. They're going to be the complete arrangement questions, the can be true questions, the can be false questions, the must be true questions, and the must be false questions. So these are the 5 major ones. And of these, the can be true, and must be false are actually the most common. The can be false is actually relatively rare. The complete arrangement is not rare. It occurs like every other game, but it occurs essentially once per game. So the remaining 3 are actually the most common. Now, there's 4 minor question types which comprise the remainder of the questions, the remaining 20 to 30%. So there are the list questions, the numerical questions, and of the numerical ones, you have greatest smallest, numerical must be true, numerical and numerical list. Then in addition to that, you have the completely determined questions and the rule substitution questions. So these comprise, like I said, the 20 to 30% of the questions that are left over. So these are the minor question types. Now, each of the question types, except actually for the complete arrangement and rule substitution ones, come in 2 different variations. So each of the question types come in 2 different variations: non-conditional question types or non-conditional variation and conditional variation. So the non-conditional questions will simply ask which of the choices could be true, must be false, etc. Whatever the question type is, they'll simply just ask that, and you won't be given any additional information. You'll just simply be asked which of the following could be true, for example. The conditional questions will give you additional information or a condition which actually narrows the scope and gives you more information to work with. So it's essentially, for example, and once again, we'll go into a lot more detail in this in the actual questions, but it's something like, if A is in group 1, then which of the following could be true? So you're given additional information and not just the question itself. So question sequence. So how do we do them, or in what sequence? Well, you need to do the questions in a particular order. So we went over basically how you're doing it, what the questions are, but you also have to keep in mind in my method, you're not just attacking the questions, you actually have to follow a specific sequence in terms of which questions you do. So how do you do that? Well, once you set up your diagram, you don't spend time making any deductions. So you're not going to make any deductions. You just set up the diagram, your movable structural elements, your rules. It's making deductions is actually unnecessary and time consuming. As soon as you have the diagram, the rules symbolized, you immediately move on to the questions. So basically, just in terms of basically explaining the sequence, you're doing the easier questions first, and you're doing those questions that will give you working arrangements first, so that you can use them for future questions to do those questions more quickly. So you do the easier ones and the ones that give you more information, so that the later questions, which are maybe more difficult or require making a bunch of diagrams, you'll have information to work with. That's essentially the logic of the sequence. Practically, what that means is that you have the following order of questions. So you do the complete arrangement questions first, and these are usually the very first questions actually in the games, right after the rules, if they're in the game, and they're in about, like I said, half the games. Then you do the can be true questions. Then you do the must be false questions, then the can be false questions, and then the must be true questions. So those are the, in terms of the major ones. Then you do your list questions, then the numerical ones, then the completely determined, and then the rule substitution. So this is the order in which you do the questions. And this is the order in which I'll present the questions. And when I have videos for full games, and when you look at my videos for full games, you'll see this is the order in which it's done. I don't want you to memorize this order now. Just I want you to have the understanding that there is a particular order, and the logic or the reason for doing it in a particular order is because you're starting with the easier questions, the ones that'll give you a couple of diagrams, so that the later questions, which maybe are a little bit more difficult or require more information, are easier to do. You're just making this a very efficient process in terms of moving through the questions as quickly and easily as possible. So this is the order. Once again, don't worry about memorizing it. We'll have plenty of time to do that, but this is the order. The other thing you need to keep in mind is that you want to do all of the conditional questions first, and then all of the non-conditionals. So what you're essentially doing is you're looking at your game, and you're looking to see, is there, well, you do the complete arrangement. That's never a conditional, but you always do that first. Then once you do the complete arrangement, you ask yourself, which are the conditional questions? And then you just focus on those. So if you have a conditional can be true, you do that first. But if you don't have a conditional can be true, and instead you have a conditional must be false, you do the conditional must be false first. So you do all of the conditionals first in this order. Then when you're done with those conditionals and you do them in this order, you go to the ones that are left that are non-conditionals, and you also do them in this order. So it's like essentially a two-pass system. You go through it twice, keeping this order. The first time you do the conditionals, then you do the non-conditionals. Once again, this is all going to make a lot more sense in the videos where we're actually going through actual games and questions. Okay, so to summarize quickly, the questions test your ability to recognize logical relationships and consequences. They deal primarily with what must or can or cannot or might not happen, and related variations to that. Attacking the questions is largely mechanical, and the questions need to be done in a particular sequence for the approach to be most effective.